Welcome, Tony, to this interview series of showcasing HKIC's leadership. It's very good to have you with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do is give a brief overview of your long and eminent career, and then we'll get into the interview.
Lovely.
Okay, so you started out in the UK. You graduated as a quantity surveyor and worked as a quantity surveyor in the UK from 1975 to the early 80s. And then you decided to come to Hong Kong, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And you continued your work as a quantity surveyor in Hong Kong before you then joined the bar in Hong Kong. And we'll also talk about that a little bit later. And for the first few years of your work at the bar, you were mainly doing advocacy work, but very shortly thereafter, you started to take appointments as an arbitrator. And so we're now looking at over 25 years of your work in dispute resolution and arbitration, serving as an arbitrator. And I think you've stopped counting, but we're looking at over 150 appointments as arbitrator, and mainly in the construction and engineering space, as well as commercial arbitrations. And you've been a member of one of the leading sets of chambers in Hong Kong, DeVoe Chambers, since 1989. You took Silk in 2008, and you have been a member of many different organizations in the Hong Kong legal community. For example, the Hong Kong Bar Association. You've been on a number of committees, the ADR committee, discipline committee, as well as the construction committee. You've taught at Hong Kong University. You were the former legal advisor to the Hong Kong Institute of Surveyors, and also you've been very heavily involved in the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, former trustee, former chairperson, and lecturer and course director. So really an integral part of Hong Kong legal society. You've also sat as a recorder in the Court of First Instance of the Hong Kong High Court. And then when it comes to HKIAC, you have served on the Appointments Committee from 2014 to 2017. You were appointed as a council member in 2016, and last year you were appointed to the Finance and Administration Committee, on which you still serve. So thank you, first of all, for your contribution to HKIAC. It's greatly appreciated. So my first question to you.
Describing me as part of the furniture.
Well, a very important part of the furniture.
Lots to feel that way.
So my first question goes back to the early days, and what motivated your decision to move from being a quantity surveyor to the law, and also to move from the UK to Hong Kong?
The move to Hong Kong was the easy one in a way. Actually, both were easy in different ways. I was working at a firm in London, and they had an appointment out here. It's the traditional Hong Kong story. It was for 2 months, and I never quite got to go back. Once I moved, I didn't really see any benefits in returning to London. I much preferred Hong Kong, so I stayed. And the move into law, well, I started studying actually effectively part-time while I was still employed, really for interest more than anything else. I thought it would be, as it was, an interesting degree to study, also a useful extra string to my bow. But once I'd finished the studies, once I'd been through the process, it just seemed like a very attractive challenge to try it out as a career, which I did. Luckily, I had a very supportive wife that funded me through the transition.
Well, that 2 months has been a long 2 months, and it's been a long 2 months, and
a happy 2 months.
Yeah, and your career move has been very successful. So I mentioned some of the ways in which you've contributed to the construction, legal work in Hong Kong and arbitration in Hong Kong, but you were part of the group of people working on the arbitration ordinance, which was really quite a milestone in Hong Kong's arbitration journey. How have you seen the evolution of Hong Kong as a seat since that time?
Well, it's really, looking back for the purposes of this exercise as much as anything else, it's brought home to me how much Hong Kong has changed and developed. My first involvement with arbitrations proper was when I joined my present set of chambers. The head of chambers when I joined was Neil Kaplan, and he unsurprisingly gave me a push in that general direction. But in those days, the centre was still in the old headquarters in Arbuthnot Road. It was very domestic oriented in a lot of its work. It was construction cases, a lot of shipping cases, relatively small proportion of international work. Facilities were, shall we say, basic by comparison to what you now have. Staff, of course, was much smaller. The workload was much smaller. It was very much a more amateur is demeaning. It wasn't amateur, but it was just small scale by comparison to what we have now. Over the years, it's grown tremendously, and your predecessors, Peter Caldwell initially, Christopher Toe, put in tremendous work to expand the centre. I'm happy to say you've taken that on very well. But there's been a big move into the international space, as well as an increasing professionalism in the staff and the size and the staff and the scope of what they have to do. So there really has been enormous changes in that period, all for the better, I would say.
I think, you know, you bring such a unique vantage point, having been in Hong Kong for several decades now and seeing so much change. And I want to ask, you know, how have you seen the construction industry change over that time, when you think about Hong Kong and all of the mega projects that go on in Hong Kong, as well as the smaller projects, but then also looking ahead and thinking about projects that will come out of the Belt and Road Initiative and also development in the Greater Bay Area. What's your take on that?
Well, the industry, the construction industry in particular, I think has gone through a change. In my very early days, when I was still a surveyor, construction arbitrations were something of a rarity. There was a culture of settlement through not mediation as such. It wasn't really a developed process. It was more of a businessman's boozy negotiation at the end of a project when they would sit down and agree things. The projects got bigger, the money in dispute got bigger, the professionals involved got more knowledgeable and a bit more legalistic about things, and generally the culture hardened. There has been obviously a move back in more recent years towards structured settlements again, towards mediation, and I think that's obviously a thing to be encouraged. But there has undoubtedly been a big increase in the number of disputes. So far as the region is concerned, the Belt and Road and the Greater Bay Area matters which are ongoing and forthcoming, really I think it's more of the same. The projects are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. When things go wrong, the money that is generated, that's lost or cost or spent, gets bigger. It's a lot harder to brush it aside or wrap it up in a deal. Everything is a bit more scaled up, and therefore it becomes more difficult to avoid disputes. A lot of these things are done on a fast track, and I think anyone involved in construction in particular will nod their head and say, yes, of course, that means more problems. So I think there has been a big increase for those reasons, and I think we're going to see a lot more going forward. Hong Kong, of course, is very well placed for Belt and Road and Greater Bay Area type disputes because of the talent pool here, because of the expertise here, and of course the legal relations that we have and the reciprocal enforcements and agreements and these sorts of things. So I can only see more and more of that type of work. Yeah, sadly for the industry perhaps, but I think it's inevitable.
Yeah, and I just want to, go back to your beginnings really, and you've got such a experience in construction disputes, having, you were a quantity surveyor originally, and that's something that parties often look for when they're appointing arbitrators in construction cases. How do you think that your background has served you as both as an advocate and also as an arbitrator, and specifically in construction disputes?
Well, I think one of the big advantages of arbitration that's sometimes a bit underplayed is having expertise in the tribunal. Now, a lot depends on the nature of the dispute, but somebody who understands how piling works or understands the logistics of moving plant around a construction site may have a comparative advantage in terms of evaluating that type of dispute. Clearly, if the dispute is centrally involved in construction of one clause in the contract, and one lawyer might be as good as another to do that. If you get involved in the technicalities, then having some exposure in the technical field, some technical knowledge, a background in it, I think is helpful. I think that's probably what got me off the starting blocks in the early days, to be frank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've we've looked back over the history of Hong Kong and HKIC and evolution in a number of ways, but I want to ask you about the future, because I know that you've been involved here at HKIC in a number of virtual hearings. In fact, you've been involved in one of the more complex arrangements, where 10-day merits hearing across, I think it was 9 jurisdictions, 11 fact and expert witnesses, joint conferencing, translation, court reporting, time zones, you name it, it was involved. Going forward, do you support generally virtual hearings, both as an advocate or for advocates and as arbitrator? And do you look forward to more of that in the years ahead?
Yeah, I think it's the way, it has to be the way forward. The hearing you mentioned in particular, it was complex. We went over a couple of weeks, but well, you may or may not know, we had basically 2 weeks with, I think, a 10-minute hitch for technical reasons through that process. It was essentially as smooth as one could ever hope for. And I was very grateful to the centre for the way they helped us out with it. I think there is a loss of personal feel in a virtual hearing. The advocates, I suspect, feel that more than the tribunal. I'm not sure, but certainly when you have the heavy load of a cross-examination and the witness is just a face on a screen, it is definitely a different feel. But having said that, if one takes a step back, there's been an increasing pressure on time in arbitrations over the last, well, several years, over quite a long period, time essentially being money. So chess clock arrangements to speed up the hearing, early loading of the process, all these things have been going on for some time. And I think this COVID interruption really has just sped up that process. I think there is a continuing move to getting things more on paper, less on the oral advocacy side of things. People have been made very conscious of the costs of getting everyone together when you have a big multi-jurisdictional dispute, the difficulties of logistics and timing that go with that. So I think it really has just provided a spike for it. The mechanisms are there. You know, they can be improved. They can go wrong from time to time, but essentially the technology has come such a long way that I think we will very likely, if not next year, within a year or two, be in a position where actually a virtual hearing is the default option. And if you want something else, you'll have to argue for it and explain why it's a good idea. I think, particularly obviously in the international sphere, that's likely where we're going to go. Yeah. And I don't see a huge loss in it. There are trade-offs, but I don't think overall it puts a huge crimp in the process. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for your time. It's been wonderful to speak to you, and look forward to working with you continually. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.